Welcome everyone to the final week of Let's Talk Professionals Conference. As many of you might already know, my name is Jiaming Liu and I am the Program Coordinator of the MGH Center for Cross-Cultural Student Emotional Wellness, as well as this conference. As people come in the chat box, we'd like to invite you to please say hello. Let us know where and who you are and where you're joining us from. I see a lot of hellos. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for sending your greetings. We unfortunately have a very packed schedule today, so I won't individually say hi to all of you, but thank you everyone, and I will officially start today's event. Today is the final event of the LTPC, Let's Talk Professionals Conference. We hope you all enjoyed our conference. From April 1st screening of mainland, we had a better understanding of the challenges and struggles of Asian international students in the US. During the April 8th event, Caring for Students of Asian Descent, we gained more knowledge on the AAPI youth mental health and their needs through presentations and discussions with mental health clinicians and researchers. On April 15th event, In Their Own Voices, Dr. Josephine Kim delivered a mini keynote on the identity development of bicultural students. And we heard from a wonderful student panel about their experiences, both in and outside of the educational system, and their recommendations on how adults can better support Asian youth. Last week, during the interactive Let's Talk Together think tank session, we connected with each other and brainstormed on ways to better support Asian and Asian American students. Can I have the next slide, please? I want to briefly remind everyone about the resources gathered from last week. Next slide. We collated your notes from different breakout room discussion into a directory where you can see what other groups talked about and took notes on. Next. To support ongoing connection and the incredible work you all do, we also created 2 Padlet pages. A business card Padlet on the left for you to leave your name and contact information for future connections and collaborations. And a resources Padlet for you where you are encouraged to leave relevant resources and links related to supporting Asian and Asian American students. Please add to Padlet pages and share with your coworkers, colleagues, and professionals. Thank you for your attention. Next, please. Tonight, we are so pleased to have you joining us for our final event in the virtual classroom. Dr. Jin Wu, Senior Lecturer, Emerita from Tufts University, will deliver a mini keynote, followed by presentations and discussions with educators and school-affiliated professionals. They will be sharing their own experiences, challenges, and successes in supporting Asian international and Asian American students. With that, I'd like to welcome Connie to get us started with tonight's event.
Thank you, Jiaming, for the welcoming remarks and for everyone joining us today. My name is Connie Her, and I am currently an educator, researcher, and coordinator for the Let's Talk conference. I'd like to give us a quick overview of our event today. We will soon move on to our mini keynote and Q&A from Dr. Jean Yuen Wu, and then 4 presentations from our fantastic guest speakers who will present to us about strategies for developing student autonomy and community integration in higher ed, how to support Asian and Asian American students and families in school settings, social emotional learning, and the importance of raising visibility of Pan-Asian communities. It is an understatement to say that this year has been challenging in so many ways. But it's also been an eye-opening year for many, and through it all, we're reminded of the ever importance of education and the need for continuous work in search of equity for all of our students. We hope that after today, our last Let's Talk Professionals conference event, that you leave with not only a sense of community and hope as we listen to the care and passion that our diverse panel holds, but also with inspiration and motivation to create change and move onwards and upwards. And so it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Jean Yuen Wu, who is the Senior Lecturer Emerita in Asian American Studies and the Department of Race, Colonialism, and Diaspora at Tufts University. She has been involved in United States higher education for more than 50 years. And in 1974, with the late Kiyo Morimoto, she co-taught the first credit-bearing college-level Asian American Studies course on the East Coast. Please welcome Jean.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Thank you. I will start then. Thanks so much, Connie. Thank you. I want to begin by saying hello to everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you for paying attention. And I want to say a heartfelt thank you to Joe Kim for including me in this wonderful space. And a huge thank you to Chao and Connie for their gracious support. Throughout 2020, as anti-Asian assaults increased, I was reminded painfully of the amnesia around Asian American history evidenced in social media, in schools, in neighborhoods, even in our own families. When brutal anti-Asian violence then surged this past January, the effects of that kind of amnesia erupted into somewhat of an epidemic. Even as we Asian Americans witnessed the lack of response from bystanders and civic leaders to our broken bodies, many of us were hounded to respond to panic demands from many institutions to provide them with informational programming just to prove that they have AAPI welfare in mind. I think this audience tonight here knows that an hour of professional development here or there, or adding an AAPI novel to a reading list, does nothing to change institutional reluctance to include our realities in any permanent or meaningful way. The panic demands are racist in themselves, putting the burden of educating on the victims of racist assaults. The existence of this immense level of ignorance more than 50 years after the inception of the Asian American Studies movement, one that has given us a wealth of materials to learn about our histories, is not an accident. The omission and erasure of Asian America in every sector of this society over half a century is intentional. It is an ongoing, systematic construction of AAPIs as not American, un-American, as a permanent other, and telegraphs that much of what is Asian America is considered inconsequential to the operations of this nation. Most of you recognize that the title of my talk borrows the second half of a saying in decolonizing education work. I think I have a slide here. And it is no history, no self, as in NO, no history, NO, no self. And the second part is my title, No History, KNOW, and KNOW, no self. This itself is a shorthand for Filipino activist Jose Real's quote, and I think I have another slide for this, and some of you may know this: those who fail to look back to where they came from will not reach where they are going. I think few here would disagree that to know where one has come from is important. Many go to great lengths to discover their origins, feeling very incomplete if they can't find the answers. Knowing where one comes from gives one grounding. It's a way to locate oneself in a context, a history that allows one to figure out how one has become who one is. It has to do with that most important of senses, the sense of self and identity. The fact is that in this society where every single person is racialized, but racial discourse remains dominated by Black and white. AAPIs, being neither and robbed of our histories, struggle with our racial location and thus our identity. I've had veteran AAPI educators confess their confusion about how they fit into racial conversation that excludes them. Their lack of confidence in having meaningful dialogues about race, especially when wanting to push back against anti-Asian racism. Silence is the common default. I want to focus here on race, as different from ethnicity, nationality, and culture. Racial location is assigned by those who have power to do so and to make it stick. You and I do not have that power. I want to focus on race because Asian America is at heart a political, as in power related, a political construction born of AAPI recognition in the late 60s, that despite our many differences of ethnicities, cultures, languages, what joins us is how we are racialized in this society and what happens to us with that racialization. This racialization, more than any other characteristic we possess, is what most defines our relation to US structural power. To understand one's racialization and its consequences is to understand how power is allocated and operates in our lives. To be oblivious results in a state of being ungrounded. My Asian students say to me, Prof. Wu, everything is always black and white. I'm not black and white. What is Asian America? Nobody cares what I say. People see right through me. I feel like a ghost. In my breakout group last week, folks agreed about the absence of history and its impact on identity. They shared how teachers try to make up for this absence. Some introduce important AAPI figures in different fields. Some shore up students' connections to their heritage cultures and languages. These efforts are aimed at countering that feeling of being a ghost and benefits many. Keep doing it. Unfortunately, being expert in our cultures and languages and seeing famous Asians represented do not add up to knowledge of a history that provides us with solid ways to understand how we are entangled with race in the US and how our lives are entangled with other lives in the US. Culture and representation do not make up for critical history. When I say critical history, I mean a history that goes beyond the platitudes to explain why we are in the conditions we find ourselves in today. Critical history reveals who holds power and how power operates structurally, constructing and maintaining systemic inequity. AAPI critical history is built from our lived experiences, our talking back, our counter narratives, if you will, to the dominant narratives of us fabricated by power holders. So to be grounded in critical history is not about knowing a list of unconnected or uncontextualized events, but it's about having access to structural analysis that can liberate us from being imprisoned in lies created about us to keep us in our place. Let me give an example. The model minority, the best known lie about us. Much energy has been spent over decades to disprove this lie. Still, it prevails, deeply embedded in the minds of all Americans, and sadly, in the minds of some AAPIs too. Dominant narratives are so ubiquitous that without grounding, it is easy to forget that stereotypes are lies. They're not based on logic or evidence, and they're created to control, not to control those they target. They're not created to describe, but to control. Stereotypes will remain as long as the purpose they were designed for, to keep a group of people in their place, is needed. The model minority is not about Americans. It is not about describing us. It was and is a racist ploy used by white power holders as the civil rights movement in the 60s gained traction to discipline Black Americans and anyone, including AAPIs and white allies, who argued for equity through structural change. Nervous whites in power concocted a diversion. Look at these Asians, they're a minority. They were discriminated against, they didn't protest, they followed rules, worked hard, and voila, success. The message to those demanding structural justice was plain: stop whining, obey the rules, and you too will make it. Asians have proved the structure works, so if you can't make it, that's on you and not the structure. You ask me, how was it a lie? Weren't Asians doing okay? And if not, didn't they push back? Critical history answers. AAPIs at that moment were 0.2% of the population, a tiny minority, visually very identifiable. And more important, they were to a person terrorized into utter silence by 5 years of Japanese American incarceration and 2 decades of surveillance, detention, and deportation of Chinese Americans throughout the McCarthy era. And this doesn't even account for the prior century of terrorization by violent expulsion and exclusion. So AAPIs at best at that moment were struggling heroically to rebuild shattered lives after mass incarceration and terrorization, hardly in a position to push back. You ask me, so which Asians were being held up as successful then? Critical history answers. The new immigrants who were let in after the war and the 1965 Immigration Act. An extremely selective immigration policy that only granted entry to Asians bringing capital and education garnered in their own societies prior to immigration. They did not make it obeying rules or using resources in the US. They came here with little knowledge of US race and racism. As newcomers in a largely hostile society, they did put their heads down to the task of surviving in racist America, and they too could not push back. But this deep history is never taught. Instead, the lie of the model minority worked and still works to obscure AAPI poverty, loss, war and racial trauma, and powerlessness in many sectors, and it continues to be used to discipline other marginalized populations. This lie engenders deep resentment of us by groups of color and whites. So is it any wonder that we end up being scapegoats and punching bags for societal crises that power holders cannot control? AAPIs being targeted by both whites and other people of color is unique to our racial treatment and trauma. This, coupled with the fact that we are seen as perpetual enemy aliens that deserve to be eradicated in the first place, explains, I think, the randomness and brutality of anti-Asian violence and the lack of response from many bystanders. The takeaway here is that first, as AAPIs ourselves, we must stop swallowing the lie of the model minority. Stop even coming close to suggesting that, well, maybe some of us really are kind of like privileged model minorities. That is an internalized oppression speaking. We must teach our youth that the model minority is a lie, is a boogeyman that harms them and others. We must teach them how to detect and unpack it and how to liberate ourselves from it. But let us get back to the long story of AAPIs in the US. Why is there an Asian diaspora in the US? Did Asians really come here to get kids a good education, make it, and never go back? Historian Gary Okuhiro reckons with this question of origins. And I quote, Asians, he says, it must be remembered, did not come to America. America went to Asia. Asians, it must be remembered, did not come to take the wealth of America. America went to take the wealth of Asia. Asians, it must be remembered, did not come to conquer and colonize America. America went to conquer and colonize Asia, unquote. So America, we are here because you were there where we called home. We are here because we have been dislocated, dispossessed, and displaced by your imperialist wars, terrorism, colonizing projects that ruptured our societies and our lives. We are here because you recruited us for our labor and pit us against non-Asian workers so that white owners could maximize their profits. Contrary to social media misinformation, anti-Asian racism did not begin with the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. It began some 30 years before, when Asians first arrived in the 1850s. Look up the Supreme Court case, People v. Hall, 1854, for a full picture of how we were racialized from the moment we arrived. 30 years of brutal mass evictions, expulsions, lynching, and the murder of Asian Americans across the West culminated in the 1882 Exclusion Act. And the act did not last for just 10 years, as Wikipedia would have you believe. It was renewed every 2 years till 1924, when more draconian laws resulted in a full 83 years of Asian exclusion. 83 years. We might pause and consider why AAPIs are only 5.8% of the population today, when we arrived in critical mass in 1850, earlier than some European immigrants, and why we are still struggling for political and social voice. AAPI immigrant narratives include many forced migrations and their attendant ruptures, searing loss and trauma, but these realities are not reflected in dominant immigrant narratives. The Exclusion Act did not only exclude, it also rendered all Asians ineligible for citizenship, which translates into ineligibility to own land, to vote, to give testimony in court, to travel. Coupled with the exclusion of Asian women and a ban on miscegenation, it was crafted to prevent Asians from setting down roots, ensuring that we would die out in one generation. This ineligibility for citizenship did not end till mid-1940s, and then only because the US Army needed Asian bodies. The Supreme Court cases of Ozawa v. US, 1922, and US v. Thind, 1923, taken together, etched into the American mind a vision of Asians as perpetual aliens. And needless to say, this is operating daily in our lives in the present. When we are brutally attacked as AAPIs, we feel killing rage and wordless grief, but there should be no shock. Remember, we were always only wanted for our labor, but not for us to stay. We were never meant to survive. We were never meant to survive. And that we did survive against all odds has everything to do with our capacity for building communities of mutual aid and for our capacity for organizing, for unrelenting resistance to oppression. That is how we survived then and how we survive in the present. Important lessons. Critical history makes abundantly clear that all of our past since 1850 is not in the past, it's very much alive in our present. If some of the connections are invisible to you, look harder. Knowing our critical history is necessary if we are to mend some of the wounds we receive as an Asian diaspora in America. I do not use the word heal because I do not believe that the wounds of racial trauma can fully heal, especially when they're still happening. But we can mend as we keep company, grieve together, and learn to build justice collectively, even in the face of wounding erasure. The scholar Ann Cheng writes, and I quote, "Asian Americans are tired of insisting that others care. The truth is that few are listening. All we can do is continue to tell our truths, to know even just for ourselves that we are here," unquote. To me, this is a call for all of us to take space, to hold space, to break our silences, to tell our stories, to tell our truths, and without apology, without apology. I had thought of titling this course, this talk, I had thought of titling it, "What does critical history have to do with AAPI mental and emotional well-being?" I didn't do that, but I still want to pose the question and offer one person's story as an answer. Years ago in one of my classes, we read about Asian exclusion and how US policies impact the most intimate of relationships in our lives, shattering families for lifetimes. That night, a student wrote me, "Dear Professor Wu, since 5, I have had stone cold anger at my mother for leaving me with my grandma when she left for America with my older sibling. I was 5. I cried for days, months. One day I stopped and I never asked for her again. I was convinced that she never wanted me. She sent for me after grandma died. I never warmed up to her. I never forgave her. I spent years wishing I could be with another family or just die. I was one of those kids who was never far off from killing herself. I now know through Asian American history that it was US racist policies that tore my family apart. Took my dad first, took my mom. She had no choice. She had no money and the people sponsoring her allowed for only one kid. It has taken me 17 years to come to this realization. I stopped crying at 5. I started crying again in this course. I am 22. I want my mother to know what I have learned, but we barely speak. But I talk to the kids I tutor in Chinatown, the ones who hate their parents, the ones who wish they weren't Asian. I tell them I was there. I try to help them to see a different picture through my story. I want to be a teacher for immigrant kids. And indeed, she has been that teacher 20 years now on the West Coast. So what indeed does critical history have to do with our well-being? And what does this say about the desperate need for Asian American history and realities to be taught in all of our schools, in every institution? I want to end with Grace Lee Boggs, who said something like this: we cannot choose the conditions that we are born into or live in, but we can choose how we think, and we can choose the kind of person we want to be, end quote. I believe that in order to make these choices, to make them wisely, we need to know our critical histories. And really knowing them involves our whole being, our minds, our hearts. It changes who we are. It has to do then with who we can become. Thank you.
Wow. I'm just going to take a deep breath. That was so powerful. Thank you, Jean, for the wonderful and thought-provoking Kina. I think one of the quotes you mentioned, Asians, we must remember, did not come to America. America came to Asia, is so powerful. And how important it is to look at history through a critical lens, and through that to look critically at ourselves and reflect and tell our stories without apologies. And the way you linked it to how being critical of history is directly tied to our well-being. I thought that was really, really beautiful. And I think it ties into the question that we have in our chat right now, is that we have an attendee asking, how do we heal? I think she's asking about how do we continue to mend and heal when the discrimination is still going on today. So if you have a little bit to say about that.
Yes, I think let me start by saying I don't use the word heal, because I really don't think we can heal when the wounding is still going on. But yes, we can mend, and we have to mend. We've been doing that, binding and mending our wounds. I think the way to do it is really sort of what I suggested, and that is that we have to talk about our daily lives, what happens to us. Asian American narrative, our own experiences that we go through, are so invisible, sometimes even to one another. I've had students who, are in classes for 2 years, and they may talk about a lot of other things, but not about their own lives, about their own struggles, their own family, and some of their own racial traumas and other traumas, right? So I think it is by talking, and it is by a collective, I want to call it a collective holding space and a collective grieving. By grieving, I do not mean a mourning that does not end. I mean that it is in grieving that we continue to see that we are human and that we can hope. And it is after we've talked about what has happened to us, then we can use sort of our anger and our grief as a kind of energy, right? We can use that to imagine otherwise, to understand what it is that we have to build to come together as a collective. More than anything, I think for Asian Americans, one of the ways that we have been able to survive is by building community, compassionate community that says, you don't have to explain. I am here, I understand, I have your back. And together we will figure out the answers. Because if for a lot of issues, we do not have the answers, right? But together we can, as a community, come together and hold one another and find answers. The other part, of course, is in order to mend, we have to get the information out, our histories, our realities. By any means necessary, we have to get them out. I don't know if we can depend just on schools. It has taken decades. So we must do it ourselves. in our own families, in our own neighborhoods, in our own groups, come together, create a history circle, read, talk, read to our kids, tell them our stories. I cannot tell you how many students have come saying, I wish my parents, my grandparents would talk to me, would tell me their stories, right? This is the way that we can create that link, a continuity, so that we see our identity as based in a long continuity, and that we see that we can resist and we can survive.
Yes, thank you. Yes, the collective grieving and turning it into energy, and in order to mend how we need to get the history and information out into our own families, classrooms, and communities. I think that's really a great point. I see that it's resonating with our audience members in the chat. And I think we have time for maybe one more question. And I think this might be helpful for many of us is, how can we find the courage to speak up and share our stories and take up space? And maybe you can also tell us just a little bit about your experience with setting up Asian American history groups or circles, and if you have any suggestions for our attendees and their institutions.
I'll talk about the courage first, right? The courage comes when we know that our voices resonate with so many. I think Asian Americans are often very silent because we doubt, right? We have this sense inside that we're floating. Where do we belong? Do we really know what we're talking about? Other people seem to know when they talk about race and this and that and their experiences and their histories. And many of us are just unsure. There isn't that confidence. And in that moment, we are silent. So our courage comes from studying together, knowing our histories, knowing that somebody resonates with us, right? And I think that that is where community is important. I don't know that by ourselves alone, right, we can ever find that, be able to talk back in the way that we can. And there are moments that I have seen folks who are incredibly silent. I've been silent 4 years for all the time I've known them in college. When they've taken a course, when they've then been with others, and because part of what we do when we talk to others is we practice. We practice what we know, we practice how to speak, we practice how to challenge, right? To disrupt racism against us, right? And then that moment comes when you're alone with a bunch of people and they have said something, or you see something missing, or something's omitted, we get omitted again. Then suddenly you realize, wait, I'm confident, I know what I'm talking about, and I can also back it up with evidence. So I'm just gonna say, hey, I just want to insert here, or have you considered, there are all sorts of ways of saying it. So I think courage comes from collective and compassionate community. Courage comes from practice. The first time, the second time, many times we just fall apart, right? We just it's like a deer in headlights, and we go silent again. For my students, and many of you must use it in your classes, we do theater of the oppressed, right? We create scenarios, right, with things that Asians hear again and again that make us crazy, that bother us. And then we say, okay, let's everyone try. So what will you say? What will you do? And see, by the time, if we do that, by the time some moments happen, you still might be very uncomfortable, but that's not the first time you've heard it. That's not the first time you understand, oh, I see, in this context, maybe I can say this. I've heard other people say this, right? So that's one thing. And the other thing about history circles, it's very new to me too, because for the years of teaching, I never needed a history circle. My classrooms were history circles, right? But since I've retired, it's lonely, right? And I also realized how hard it is without the classroom. Which is why I still want to press, though. I don't want history circles to somehow substitute for really embedded courses in curriculum across the nation. But we can't wait that long, so we must start to educate. So history circles really just require a bunch of people, and Zoom has made it wonderful. I have a history circle or a talk with somebody who's a couple people in California, one in Hawaii, one in Minnesota. That wouldn't have been possible, but you can do that in your own neighborhood too, right? We can do however you want to. It's a bunch of people who really are, it's like a reading group. We're committed to coming together, reading something or finding somebody's syllabus, reading it, coming together to talk. But importantly, it's all of us linking our lives into it. I think some people think of history as boring. You study history and you just read and read and read, and then read some more, and all these people who write. History, it's about talking to history. right? If I read Ron Takaki's history and he says something and I'm like, well, my life wasn't quite like that. Let me think of, right? It's talking. So one of the important things though, to have these history circles to come together and do that, or maybe do some writing too. It's about our narratives, right? To find voice, is to make sure that you have the resources to have good critical history. And if I think I gave my contact information, if anybody wants syllabi, good stuff, let me know. And so many of you already know. I mean, I think we have more than enough materials, but it is about coming together so that we can talk to one another. It's not about sitting there just reading history. History is alive. We are making history as we go. We have to trust that we can, and we should tell our students, we have to teach our students, they have the power to make and to write history. We have to write our own critical history as we are reading history from the past. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jean. Yes, we have to write our own critical history, and as in the chat, to really gain that confidence, right? To speak up, to practice and find your voice. Not everyone's voice is the same, but it comes with practice and with knowing the history. I think that gives you the confidence to speak up, right?
When we're grounded in history, we can, because people will say, well, what are you talking about? What do you mean? And we can say, well, I can tell you what I mean. I know, I can tell you the history, right? So often Asian Americans are silent because we have been robbed of that history, and we really have to have that grounding first. Then I think we can build our own voices, but also we can then build really true coalitions with other people of color across the board, all people, right? Because if we're not sure about our history, we don't know how to connect. And once we know that history, it's also about knowing other people's. So Asian American history didn't happen in vacuum. It happened in connection with whites, with blacks, with Latinx, with indigenous folks. So once we know that history, we can say, well, here, let me tell you the story. Let me tell you a story. Right?
Thank you so much. We have Dr. Wu's information in the chat. I'm sure there are many more questions. I'm sure you can reach out to her.
Yep.
And thank you so much, Dr. Wu.
Thank you. I'm gonna mute out now, right?
Yes, thank you so much. Great. So, wow. Whew. I'm also going to take another breather. I'm sure attendees, you can also take a deep breath. And I would love to introduce our first short presentation speaker, Vino, who is the Director of English Language Programs of Brandeis University. She organizes and oversees the Gateway Scholars Program, amongst many, many other things. And this program, she designed it and will tell us more about it today. So Vino.
Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be here today. I will not pretend that anyone can fill or follow Dr. Wu, but I look forward to giving you my very brief presentation. If we could go to the next slide. So in 2008, I developed a program that I called the Gateway Scholars Program at Brandeis University. And this program was meant to be for international first-year students from various countries in the world. It would be a 7-week intensive program. And I think it's important to say what the program is not. So the first thing is, it's not an intensive English program per se. It does not admit students conditionally. So it's every student who gets into this program is a fully matriculated Brandeis student, but they can fail the summer courses if they don't put their hearts and souls into studying all of the things that we want to teach them. And in 2008, when I developed this program, the first year of this was in 2009. And this was when we began to see a large surge of international students from China. Certainly, we have always in US higher ed had a certain number of international students from Asia and many other parts of the world, but Asian countries in general. But the surge of international students from China began in 2007, 2008, 2009, and then definitely increased exponentially in the next 10 years. So the goal of the Gateway Scholars Program was to prepare high-performing, talented international students. They're already very good. And the goal was to take students with just one or two ways in which they would not have made it into regular admissions, and to gather these students and to put them together in a classroom and to challenge them. So it isn't really a language program, but it is an immersion in US culture, in how to succeed in the United States, in all of the things that they need to know. So at the end of these 7 weeks, students are evaluated through their performance in the course, all 3 courses, as well as all the extracurricular activities that we have them do. And they continue to take Brandeis courses. And what we have found in the past 10 to 12 years is that we have very, very high retention rates for these students. These students have integrated into the US community and made large numbers of good networked friends throughout the world, as well as in the US. And they tend to feel a greater sense of belonging in the United States, whether or not they remain here. If we could go to the next slide. Thank you. So the academic program consists of 3 intensive courses. The first course is critical reading in the humanities and the social sciences. And the second is analytical writing. And the third is academic oral communications. I'm going to talk a little about the content of each of these courses and the reasons for which I designed them the way that they are. So first, I think it's important to acknowledge that students from other countries who come here do not automatically feel at home, and they do not automatically know everything about their host country. They've committed to doing a 4-year undergraduate degree in the United States, but they do not have everything they need to succeed. That has to be developed, and that has to be taught. And one of the key things is that every child, no matter where they are, is exposed to prejudices, is exposed to the environments. And we wanted students to start learning about the United States in a completely stress-free environment. So the students were told that they're not competing for a place in the program. They are competing against themselves, because everybody has a place in the program. And what we learned is that large numbers of these students suffer from imposter syndrome. Now, this is not news to anyone. Everybody, I think studies have shown that about 90-something% of people suffer from imposter syndrome. But where these students were concerned, imposter syndrome manifested itself in a reluctance to ask for help because they did not want to reveal the gaps in English language proficiency. So in other words, they were afraid to be seen as admissions mistakes if they express themselves. So we immediately made sure that during Welcome Week, the first week of the program, we gave them intensive talks on class participation. We explained to them that everyone feels this way, and it's okay to try to pronounce things, and it's okay to make mistakes. And we found that it had a huge impact. Students' performances in critical reading, in analytical writing, in academic oral communications all went through the roof. They started competing as they went into their first semester at Brandeis, their first fall semester at Brandeis. We noticed that they were outperforming regular intake students, both domestic and international, which was pretty incredible. So the things that we taught them in critical reading, we gave them a grounding in critical race theory, in Kimberly Crenshaw's ideas of intersectionality, of gender, of sexuality. of language and reading as in itself an inherently flawed vehicle to absorb knowledge. I have a question in the chat that says, who paid for this program? Basically, this was a program that was initially just sort of advertised widely. There was a fee that students had to pay for the summer program if they wanted it. And we were amazed at how many students wanted to take this program and get into Brandeis this way. We often even got regular intake students who said that they wanted to be part of the Gateway Scholars Program, even though they were regular intake. So, you know, that was really very gratifying. So some of the things that we did was we talked about how English itself is a colonial language. It's a complete appropriations nightmare. We talked about how they're trying to perform in a language while acquire it at the same time. This is like asking a family of 6 to live in a house that's being renovated. It's impossible. It's hard. Like, you're competing with native speakers who have, I wouldn't say no language challenges, but I'd say, you know, fewer language challenges. And at the same time, you are trying to make your mark in an institution that hands out a 4-year degree. This is not a small thing. And with analytical writing, what we found was that there was a great deal of initial reluctance in the first week of their course for analytical writing to feel that argument is a frightening thing. So we talked to them about the argument culture in the United States, and we talked to them about how in the United States, and especially at Brandeis University, it is important to argue something. And arguing something is going to be the status quo, the norm in all of your papers, more or less, even in science papers. But we also made sure that these students were given a very rich smorgasbord of socio-academic components. So the first thing we did was we made sure that the academic oral communications practicum, which is a whole day where they just practice all the things they learn in academic oral communications, that happened under the supervision of instructors and peers. To give you an example, students are not immediately aware that there's such a thing called small talk. And in many countries, small talk is actually avoided with strangers. So this was something that they were very surprised to hear about and took a lot of training to get used to. We gave them faculty lectures in a variety of different fields. And the reason we did this was because, you know, students would say things to me initially like, oh, but I'm going to be a science major. I don't need to know about the Odyssey. And we said, actually, you do. Everybody needs to know a little bit about everything. We also made them do community service. And we gave them the opportunity to go to the in-house restaurant at Brandeis University and have lunch with staff and faculty. This would teach them to practice their small talk, as well as give them an opportunity to eat while they're talking and learn how to do that. That is a skill on its own. We gave them special performances. We took them to drama performances far and wide in the Boston area. And this was paid for in the student budget, in the program's budget. And we made them adapt a book by Margaret Atwood, a feminist take on the Odyssey. We made them do adaptations of that book that would give them experience writing a screenplay and discussing issues of gender and sexuality. May we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. We also made sure that they had a rich interaction with their peers. The Gateway Liaison Leader program, this was domestic peers. The Gateway Mentor program, this was students who had been through the Gateway Scholars program before. And the Upperclassmen Buddy program paired them up with one domestic person in the United States at Brandeis throughout their first year. And they also had meetings with me, and they had a weekly ELP tutorial service throughout any writing intensive class that they took. Could we go to the next slide, please? I'm just going to wrap up really quickly. So one of the things we learned during the online version of this course is that we needed to be sensitive to students' social, economic, and social cultural contexts. So we made sure that instructors were very clear on making that choice. In terms of subject matter and materials for the students, it needed to be grounded in a US base so that the students were kept completely safe. We used the academic context in the US, and there's more examples of what that means in the slide itself, as you can see. We used multimodal methods of instruction. We made sure that we said things in different ways and gave them written forms of the notes, as well as made sure that they got the information in various other ways. We didn't just rely on one way of giving them information. And we made sure that we set very clear goals for them. The program continues to be a roaring success, and we are looking forward to the 12th year this year. Thank you very much, everyone. And if there's any questions for me, I'd be delighted to have them come up in the chat.
Thank you so much, Vino. What an incredibly supportive program. And thank you for sharing about your learnings as it in the virtual context as well. I think we can move on to our next presentation. Any questions for Vino, please put it in the Q&A box. It is my pleasure to introduce Maggie Shi. Maggie is a school counselor and Asian Student Union advisor at Lexington High School in Massachusetts. She is a leading member of the Lexington Public Schools Employees of Color Affinity Group. Please welcome Maggie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Maggie Shi, and I am currently working as a school counselor at Lexington. I come with actually also a 20-year history in working with diverse Asian and Asian American adolescents in a variety of roles and settings, including courts, hospitals, and community organizations. I am also an LICSW withholding both adjustment and school guidance counseling licenses. And in the context of today's talk, I thought it important to note that the district I work in currently holds the largest Asian student population in all public schools in Massachusetts, with over 40% of its student population identifying as Asian and Asian American. Lexington Public Schools also has students from more than 37 countries, adding to the diversity of our school system. I'm here to share first about what I learned in my role working at Lexington Public Schools to be practical and relevant factors in supporting Asian and Asian American students, their families and staff needs in the context of the recent rise in anti-Asian hate crime and COVID-19. I will also address practical factors in the school setting for supporting this population around its DEI and social emotional needs. I thought it best to start my talk with sharing my personal experience of how Lexington students and staff came together the week of the tragedy in Atlanta. The timelines and list of players can be found on the next slide. At 7:30 a.m., the morning after the Atlanta attacks, I received a flurry of texts on my cell from the Employees of Color district leadership team I'm a part of, and a call from an African-American colleague on the team to check in on me. I cannot express how much their timely support and thoughtfulness, understanding the significance of the situation, still means to me. We discussed our next steps as a group, which involves sending out a statement and a list of resources to all district employees. At 8:15 a.m. that morning, I connected with my assistant director of counseling, updating her to its potential impact on our department meeting that morning. Interestingly enough, we invited Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion District Director Johnny Cole to help us debrief as a department about the support we offered students and each other for the Capitol insurrection in January at 8:30 a.m. that morning. And everyone in our department was made aware of this new situation at that time. After the meeting, a group of us from the department created a statement against the violence that we sent to all Lexington High School students, offering affinity and allied spaces and a list of resources for them to access. It helped, as I mentioned, that we had offered similar statements and spaces before. Later that day, an official statement was released by our superintendent to the entire Lexington Public School community regarding her support for Asian and Asian American students and their families impacted by recent events, and intolerance for racist attitudes and behavior, with a detailed list of resources. The Employees of Color Leadership Team also released its statement to all employees with notice of offering affinity listening spaces for staff. The Asian Student Union leaders from our school shared a statement acknowledging the event and their stance against the recent rise in anti-Asian hate crime at the start of their virtual, very well-attended Asian Night. And the students went a step further and opened up their regular club meeting space to the entire Lexington High School Asian student community to create a safe space for those that would like to attend in collaboration with the counseling department for safe, thoughtful communication, addressing the differences and processing how students might have felt impacted by these events. Our quick response was a result of many years of selfless hard work at the grassroots level that helped establish collaborative relationships. New leadership that prioritized DEI work, and earlier organized statements and circles in response to other racially charged incidents in the past year. Through this experience, and many I've had over the years, I've learned that work in addressing the challenging DEI and social emotional needs of our students and staff cannot be done in isolation. Its success is dependent on a connecting network of relationships that need to be established over time and based on mutual respect and trust. I shared a slide capturing some retroactive thoughts, which is the next slide, about this process, including what we do differently, as there's always room to improve. One thing I found is that when familiar spaces were offered during a time set apart from the school, like advisory, which is in the school schedule, we had a much larger turnout opposed to lunch and after school blocks. It also sent the message that it is important to administration and faculty and that they value such spaces and destigmatizes those that may choose to attend. In terms of the second part of my talk, regarding practical factors for addressing general social emotional needs of Asian students and their families, which is the next slide. I want to start by acknowledging that those attending this conference come from all different communities and even from other parts of the world. I will go through some practical things one can do or consider in offering support to your specific Asian student population in the following slides. For the sake of our time together, I will not go through all the resources or examples listed on the slides, but I do encourage you to reference them after the talk or to reach out to me to learn more about what is on them. My first point, coming from a social work lens, is that it's important to take the time to get to know your Asian student population and to acknowledge their diversity and differing needs. I identify now as a proud Korean American, but I can acknowledge I did not always grow up feeling this way, especially in Minnesota and even as an international student in Korea. My personal experience points to the fact that not all Asians, even in the same ethnic background, may experience things the same. I've had the privilege of working with students in many different communities with a broad, beautiful range of Asian colored populations, reflecting diverse histories, cultures, and social economic backgrounds. No matter where you find yourself, it never hurts to explore how to work on building a sense of belonging for all people groups and validating differences, be it Cambodian, Vietnamese, Bangladeshi, Indian, Korean, Japanese, Chinese, etc. Tomorrow, I will be working with a group of students and educators at a monthly Lex Chat Club discussion about the history of anti-Asian hate crime and the model minority myth, including its origins in justifying white supremacy. A colleague brought up the fact that many Korean massage workers in Atlanta felt like they had little choice in doing manual work due to their lack of English speaking skills. And last spring, the ASU club I had helped advise hosted watch parties on the PBS Asian American series, where it did a great job highlighting how as Asian Americans, we share a diverse history of oppression and racism with other Asian groups, including Turkish, Indian, Japanese, and Filipinos, and speaks also to the beautiful partnership with our Black and Brown brothers and sisters. In regards to my next slide, addressing general factors, we can move to the next slide. Oh, sorry, go back one. Yes, thank you. It helps not to be reactive, but have a shared thoughtful process and protocol in response to crises, be it for highly sensitive mental health or other related situations. At LHS, we have a structure with regular student support team meetings across disciplines with administration, nursing, social work, special education, and counseling members at the table. This team of interdisciplinary members developed a crisis response flowchart protocol that is now used across the district. It may be helpful when explaining to a student or family from an Asian background that there is a system that has been put in place regarding our need to report as mandated reporters in cases of threat of harm to self or others. Another practical factor is to translate materials and create access to skilled translators to offer clear, culturally sensitive communication with students and families. And I heard that some of our buildings even have created signs in other languages. And I know that much thought has been put into simplifying registration materials for new transfer students and their families where English may not be their first language. There is also a growing appreciation and understanding about the importance of PD work for our professional development work, for staff administration, and for personal growth in DEI work. And so one of the things that's great, that's new in our district, or relatively new, is that all new staff in the pre-professional track has a requirement now to complete a DEI PD class offered by the district. I am also honored to continue the work of another former panelist, colleague and friend, Cynthia Tang, who developed a wonderful PD seminar educating educators titled Walking in the Footsteps of Asian Students and Their Families. In addition to PD work for staff, there have been some movements in creating mindful curriculum changes, such as Asian authors, senior English electives, and we have a pending school-wide book read from an Asian American author to include diverse histories and voices. I do want to also say a quick shout out to the amazing Boston Public School students that shared last week about their advocacy work for diversifying school curriculum to include more minority voices, and leads well into my last, but certainly not least point and slide about tapping into our students' parent and community resources for support in this work. And for the sake of time, please reference them for examples from the Lexington community. So I just wanted to say that I feel humbled and honored to be working with such a great group of caring individuals who have been carrying the torch long before I came along. I've been personally inspired by my time at Hugsy, learning from Dr. Jo and seeing her vision for the help of others, including those from MGH, that led us to where we are today at Let's Talk. I look forward to what we can all accomplish together in practically supporting our students, families, and staff wherever we are in our corners of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie, for sharing your experience, response, and learnings after the tragic day of the Atlanta shootings. I'm sure many here today responded to the event in different ways, and we're also reminded of the importance of having these support systems in place to support our Asian students, families, and staff. Next, we have An Ping. Shen, who is a veteran assessment specialist in the Student Assessment Office Services of the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. Welcome, Anping.
Thank you very much, Connie, and thank you to all the people who provide this wonderful event. And I have learned about this event for quite a few years, but I was very honored and humbled to have a chance to talk. Well, Connie, nice for you to say I'm a veteran educator, but I'm still learning as all of us as education professionals, we have to keep learning. And also, I have to say that I learned a great deal from Professor Wu and other speakers. I'm also happy to hear Maggie Shi is working in Lexington, where quite a few of my friends live there. And I sometimes heard they said, well, you know, Lexington is better than city of Newton, where I work here. And I always have a little bit interesting conversation with them. So my talk will focus a little bit on the social emotional learning. Can we have the first slide? And I think this is my perspective. So I would be a little bit more open-minded and less eloquent than my previous colleagues. So I will be more kind of, free-minded and share my thoughts. Now, why I like to talk about social emotional learning, that's probably started myself. I think about 10 years ago, when the famous book, The Better Time of the Tiger Mom, came out by Yale professor Amy Chow. And I think that was quite a storm in the field of education, especially for the Asian community. And I think many people might miss the theme of that book, as Amy Chow herself noted quite a few times. That book was written a little bit tongue-in-cheek, and also as her self catharsis, she was trying to learn from her own parenting experience. And for those people who read the whole book, I don't know how many, but I did read the book at the urge of my son. At the very end of the book, Amy Chow talked about her personal experience when the whole family was visiting Russia in a very fancy restaurant near the Red Square, the center of the Moscow, where she emphasized her kids should eat the famous dish in the those expensive restaurants, the fish seeds. I don't know of any special term for that dish, but her younger daughter, Lulu, I believe, hated this dish. And Amy just demanded she had to eat. That's why we came to this restaurant. And finally, her daughter just threw the dish on the ground, smashed the plate, and the whole restaurant people just stopped looking at them, and she ran outside and stayed outside for quite a while, and then she decided she's going to write the book about that. But the book, I wrote an open letter, mainly to discuss what I learned. Amy Chow, certainly very well, educated as a Yale professor, and she grew up in America, and she should have all the best elite education, but she would have made such a mistake. And clearly we could see that her social emotional competency were not that high. And but also we as Asian parents, we can all relate to that in various ways. I look at my parenting practice. So in that sense, she still could be considered as a teacher, to us, where, she shared her experience. So, and also, as we all know that the social emotional learning is very critical, even more than ever for past decade. And we all know that now Asian students are facing tremendous challenges in terms going to colleges, and the perfect SAT scores will not be good enough. The 5.0 GPA, as many students taking the honor AP courses, so the GPA will not help that much. And the lawsuit against Harvard University. And so I try to be a little bit self-critical, what we can do to improve ourselves. And I think also when I came to Newton School Committee, my platform was academic excellence. But gradually I learned, even though 10, 20 years ago, we can talk about educational or academic excellence, but now the definition of this excellence is expanding, as many of you have already learned or probably working hard. And I think Maggie is working that field, how to increase the students' social emotional competency, and not only for Asian students, but for whole community. So again, we can look at these 5 key areas. We can see, especially for social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making, we have a long way to go, including myself. So for past 3.5 years, since I've been on school committee, I learned we have 3 pillars for Newton Public School System: equity, excellence, and social emotional learning. So I'm trying to, enhance my concept of educational excellence, including all these 3 areas. Let's move to next slide, please. So what are the SEL challenges and lessons? I think, first of all, SEL has more urgency and significance for all stakeholders. And starting from the family, this is the foundation of starts from parents. And certainly, as someone who came from China when I was already middle-aged, and I'm still learning how to be socio-emotionally competent, and to work in the family with kids, communicate with kids, with my colleagues in school community and in workplace. And unfortunately, we did not develop that kind of competency when I was in China. And I reflect a lot. I even wrote a book about my son growing up here, and I included quite a few stories about me making a lot of mistakes in communicating with my son and my daughter, and made terrible mistakes, even though I was supposed to educator, got advanced degrees in education. And of course, for school, as I mentioned, excellence, equity, and SE well-being. And community, I think that's important. And for past few years, I tried to speak more loudly, raise my voice about our Asian students' needs. I'm very glad to hear Maggie mentioned the how to work with community. And one of the strategy is to increase language, not only English, but other languages for our Asian and minority families. And I emphasized, I stressed at school committee that we need to have foreign language translation for school survey. And I'm very glad Newton School Department has embraced my proposal to now translate all those surveys and documents into different languages, and that increased the participation. So, and also our culture, I would emphasize this is a reckoning and embracing moment. Reckoning, as Dr. Wu mentioned, that we have history, but the history was never in the official narrative. We have to speak up. We have to stand out. But also I would like to emphasize, as Asian community, especially as people like me came from different culture, we have to embrace the culture here. We have more reflection. So I want to emphasize, we want to be more involved in the community. And so this is a very important awareness and enhancement for all of us. For our parents, this is very critical. And again, I use the Amy Chua example. Even for her to grow up here, to be educated here, she still had tremendous challenges. But what about the other people who grew up in different culture and trained in different culture and came here like me? It's huge battle. For 30 years, I'm still learning. So when I have parenting classes with our community, I always emphasize, don't think you have all the knowledge and skills to handle a lot of issues. And just look at me. I've been working at Department of Education for over 20 years. I had advanced degrees. I wrote a book. I'm still learning. And as a matter of fact, yesterday when I had a conversation with my son, and I told him that he bought a gift for me for Christmas, which is a VR game. I love the ping pong game. I played quite a lot. And then my son said, Daddy, when I was a kid, when I wanted to play computer game, you stopped me. You thought this was wasting my time, has no education value. And I brushed aside first time he mentioned this. And then last night he said again, and he's, Daddy, what do you think? I know he was pressing for an apology, even though he's 35 years old. And finally, I say, yeah, Jason, you're right. I made a mistake, computer game. As a matter of fact, even he started a company a few years back working with the computer game teams at the university level. So it's very ironical, but also it's a great learning experience. I want to emphasize, are we ready to strive from great to leading AA students? Working at Department of Education, I've seen all the data about Asian students and all minority students. I would proudly say that Asian students, academically speaking, now surpassing all minority and white students. Used to be the math Asian student did so well, but now for English, Asian students are doing better, even though not significantly, but still better. Imagine probably about half of the Asian students' parents do not have English as their first language. Remember that. So it's a tremendous accomplishment, but that's not enough, as we all learned. So come to the last slide. Do I have much time? I want to make sure I'm not over using my time. So Connie, we can just remind me.
Yes, just 1 minute. Thank you.
Okay. I probably will exceed that 1 minute, but we talk the talk. So can we walk the walk? I'm reminding myself every day when I'm working at school committee. So it's important. Let me emphasize the what I have used at the We Care for parenting, but also for my practice. We stands for whole education. We should emphasize whole education, not only academic, but also social emotional learning. And we should also emphasize on the equity. We have to work with other, as my previous colleague said, Black and brown brothers, sisters. And that's exact right when I'm working at school committee. Recently we had an incident at the one school, a white kid bullied a Chinese American kid and used the word CHINK, and that was bombed. And when I got the news, I contacted the parent. I said, we have to raise the voice. We have to use this as our rallying to emphasize we have to work with school systems. So there was some resistance, and some people even did not understand fully this CH word is same as the N word. We have to do something. So finally, the school department agreed to do some forum in community. So communication, that's the key. And then appreciation. We have to appreciate our history, but also the American history to work together. And we have responsibility. That's what I'm doing right now to support our students, to support all the students in need. So finally, we have to enhance our community. This is our home now. So we have to grow together. And unfortunately, I have a lot to say, but time is up. I know Connie is looking at me. So I hope I still have more time to talk because I love to share my views on a lot of things. Thank you so much. And
Of course.
if you have any ideas, my email address here. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please feel free to reach out to his email. Next, we have Nora, please.
Yes, hello everyone. Yes, my name is Nora Yasamura, and I'm very excited to be here with you all and to have this opportunity to share my thoughts and to be with these wonderful other panelists. I wanted to start off to share that I'm going to try to move fairly quickly so we can get through the question and answer period. So please hang in there with us because we definitely want to hear more of your questions. A lot of my information that I'm going to share is coming from over 20 years of working specifically in education, but particularly with the Pan-Asian community. And I've had an opportunity to serve as the Pan-Asian advisor and Dean of Student Life at Dartmouth College for almost 13 years, but also I currently work in an independent private school. And so I've actually worked through kindergarten through college. And I tried for this talk to think about what were some of the themes that has kind of followed me through these 20 years, but also through all these different developmental ages, because I know a lot of the educators that you're all from working with different age groups. And I landed on this topic of invisibility, the importance of raising the visibility, because that is one of the things that's really followed consistently, unfortunately, through these different decades. And so if you can go to the next slide, the focus I was going to hopefully have was really focusing on three primary topics. What is, why we see that invisibility is a problem? Well, of course, Jean has already done an amazing job to talk a bit about that from a historical perspective. And I know many folks, when I had an opportunity to be in the think tank conversations, I've already talking a lot about model minority myth, which again is really important. And I'll just emphasize three things in that particular topic. One is what I still see is very prevalent is that there's assumption that when we talk about the Pan-Asian community, we're really just talking about East Asian or just Chinese culture. I see that in a lot of schools. I think I also see the assumption that these students are if they're not complaining, then they're all doing fine. They're all doing really great. And I'll sort of give an example. When I worked at Dartmouth College, one of the ways that the support individuals who were supporting students and they would identify a student was struggling was if a student was stopped going to classes, for instance. And that was one way they would know that that student needed help. But sometimes in the Pan-Asian community, there was actually, the students would even work harder when they were struggling. And so that was just a kind of bringing in a cultural competent kind of perception of where that model minority myth was really making it difficult, that we weren't able to see all the unique strengths, but also the complex needs in the Pan Asian community. Another just piece around the model minority myth that I think is also another assumption is that international students aren't impacted by racism. If they don't talk about it, then they're not being impacted, which of course is quite false. Another reason why I think invisibility is why it happens is because social identity is very complex for students in all these different age groups. And racial identity formation and understanding that is particularly very complex in the Pan Asian community. And so as I was talking about how perhaps somebody who's just learning about the history or understanding what does race mean in the US context, you know, they will be watching what's happening on the news currently, or even have their own microaggression or overt racist act that happens to them, and they're needing to kind of process that. Their nervous system is going to, of course, react to it, but they may not have the words, they may not know how to express what's happening to them. And again, that will make these needs become even more invisible. And then also we have folks from, you know, a wide range of backgrounds, you know, within the Pan Asian community. So it's layered of social identity. So that's layered of gender identity or sexual orientation or different abilities. And again, those even within the Pan Asian community, some of those topics are hard to talk about. So people feel that level of invisibility being layered, and that makes it hard for other people to understand. I think there's also been a lot of great talks about how there's a lot of pressure to position ourselves in the Pan Asian community as associated with whiteness for safety and acceptance. And also, you know, there's a lot of pressure to sort of feel like we have to perform very well educationally also for safety and acceptance. And that has very problematic pieces around perfectionism that can happen, and also for people to shed parts of who they are to try to gain that acceptance. So another piece, just to stay with this idea of kind of why is there invisibility? Well, I think there's a lack of invitation and permission for people to share their experiences and needs in the different schools. And I think that it's important that we think about ways that the institution is asking, how are things going? So are we doing, for instance, climate surveys? Are we understanding and finding anonymous ways for students to report if things are happening? Are there affinity spaces that are inviting people to really go into that sort of comparing and contrasting? And I won't go into that. That is a topic that I love, and I have often spoken for Let's Talk About This topic, but I think it's important to underline how important affinity spaces are to kind of normalizing and affirming. And that's just a structural way that we provide permission and invitation to really unearth how people are doing. So what are some of the common trappings that I have observed individuals or schools falling into? I think the main piece is that we tend to rely on volunteers in schools. And so it ends up being very individually driven. And we tend to have those really focused on events and programs. And this is really quite limiting because, of course, events and programs are important, but they're not everything. We tend to also want to kind of position the schools to look at cultural celebrations. And again, cultural celebrations are really valuable. And even when I was at Dartmouth College, my first title was, I think, Asian Pacific American Programming Liaison. And people would write to me and say, oh, can you help the Chinese dance troupe come and perform? And I was really felt like I was sort of thought myself as so much more complicated than that. But I think when a school will really see the Pan Asian community as just something where we can celebrate our culture and only do events, that's very problematic. And so another kind of common trappings is just this lack of institutional understanding and ownership. And there was lots of great talk in the think tanks about how important it is to have this work of the Pan Asian community positioned within the diversity and inclusion work that again, we're not just looking at culture, but we're also looking at race and kind of thinking about it in the context of other BIPOC community members. That, again, there's a lack of understanding of really what it takes about having money, resources, people to really provide, I think, the support to really help to understand the needs of the community, but also to meet those needs. Also, there's been a lot of conversations about how important it is the common trappings of not having it in the curriculum. And again, not just as one section or one day of talking about the Pan-Asian community history or experiences, but to have it really centered within the curriculum. And also, again, just I want to sort of give a shout out for other adults about how valuable and important it is. And I think Maggie spoke about this earlier about how important it is to also have the coalition building and also support for the Pan-Asian adults in your schools. And I just can't say enough about how when we take care of ourselves, how much better we can meet the needs of other students. And the last part that I want to sort of say is it's really important to think about creating a movement. So again, getting out of this individual event thinking and really moving into how do we create a movement. So if I can get the next slide. For the next slide, I really wanted to just really briefly mention, just for sake of time, and then we'll move into questions, about when you're trying to create a movement, you're really wanting to think about how to do this at 3 different levels, and they're actually dynamic or interconnected. So individual interventions is when things are happening at the sort of one-on-one or interpersonal level interventions. Cultural interventions are things around, actually, let me just back up and say individual, and let's move to institutional. Institutional interventions are examples where the institution is taking responsibility, it's systemically resources are put in place, it's embedded into the center of what the school does. And then cultural is really around those cultural norms. How does the cultural norms support whatever intervention that you're doing? And again, you know, I can, if people are interested, I can share a little bit more examples in the question and answer period. But I think you really want to make sure, I think a movement has these 3 elements. If you just take any one of them, you're often not going to create the kind of movement that I think we're all coming on this call together to want to inspire to do. So thank you.
Thank you, Nora. We will now be able to move on to, I think, the long-awaited discussion and Q&A with all of our amazing, amazing, fantastic panelists today. And to moderate for us today, we have Shub. Please feel free to introduce yourself, and all panelists, you may turn on your cameras, and thank you. Can't wait.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Let's Talk team. I am, as a school counselor, just as eager to hear from our panelists. So I say let's just jump straight into this conversation and use up as much time as we have. So our first question, I guess I want to first address a question in the chat to Jean. We have many requests for your syllabi. So I think what we'll try to do is through the Let's Talk team and Connie and folks, get folks your resources and maybe gather some things to email out. So we will do that on behalf of our attendees because we know we have so many folks who are interested. So let's jump into the next question. This is for you, Nora. We have some ideas around what you described in terms of the different levels of kind of ways we can address what you're talking about. Could you give us some examples as we kind of think through what you're talking about?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so one example would maybe be around the idea of names. So I think most of us probably have had experience where students either feel that people mispronounce their names or they feel pressure to change their name to meet other people's needs. This is actually a microaggression, but an institutional example of something that I just find so troubling. And again, I have found that troubling for decades now. This is not a new thing. So at the individual level, a student may feel like, again, an incident happens and somebody calls them, mispronounces their name. An intervention at an individual level is that the student begins to recognize that it is their choice, that they feel that they have the ability to decide what they would like, what preferred name they would like to use. And again, there isn't one particular right answer for that. It is very personal for folks. I think because we can recognize how important names are towards our own identity and our own identity formation. And then I think institutionally, what happens a lot of times is, again, there's a sort of normalizing. It's a cultural as well, but I would almost say for most of the schools that I've been in, it's actually at the institutional level, because it's so ingrained. And sometimes it might be at the private school where I work now, a lot of times people will say the consultants have told them that they have to change their name, or again, there's lots of this kind of pressure. And so one of the things that we did at my current school is we used a thing called Name Coach, and we actually got it institutionally into a place where actually in the very beginning, everybody in the school is asked, regardless if your name is hard to pronounce or not, to put your name, just the way we do sort of now with pronouns. We're normalizing that we shouldn't take for granted that everybody knows how to say each other's names, and really centering how important that is as just a point of respect. And again, so now, we have places where you can actually listen. So it's on the teacher or each other to learn each other's names. So you record your name. In the end of my last name is actually the easiest name to say, Nora Yasamora. It's like beautiful name. And I can't tell you how many people mispronounce it, but actually in the bottom of my name signature is now a place you can click on it, and nobody says my name wrong anymore at my school. And so it's just one of these areas that you need to think about institutionally how you can do that, but then social culturally embed it into the culture, make it a norm, explain why it's important. I think another just quick area is also around, Maggie made me think of this, around this sort of racial incidents that have happened. Again, we know that there are microaggressions, which are interpersonal acts of racism. And I think that those things happen at the individual level, and we need to reach out to students to say that does happen and it's not okay. And, we need to individually provide space for them to process that. But also at the institutional level, we need to think about, do you have a bias reporting form? Are you having ways institutionally that you're helping students to feel empowered to speak out, and dealing with some of the power dynamics? And also social culturally, is it okay for people to have a safe place to sort of talk about these different instances and process them? So these are just examples of how, again, you can see if you just do it at interpersonal level, we're really not going to create a lot of movement. You probably will help individuals, there's no doubt. But if we want to move, which I think, Jean is a great reminder, I love her passion, is that, like, I feel like, Jean, that you're like the stakes are high, like enough, let's do more. I think we can raise the bar, and we should. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I feel like so much of this has to be to take the onus and put it onto the institutions, right? To actually do the work. So I appreciate that perspective. And I know as an educator, I appreciate just really concrete examples. And in honor of examples, I'd actually like to ask Maggie to, if you could elaborate. I think a lot of folks resonated with the collaboration that you kind of mentioned across disciplines to further support your Asian and Asian American students. Could you kind of articulate a little bit of what that looked like in your school?
So I mentioned that there was a grassroots movement that's been happening for a long time in Lexington. And I think that it took time to build trust and respect and work across district, across disciplines, to sort of acknowledge the importance of acknowledging, I guess, the needs of Asian students and their families, specifically in regards to what I'm addressing at this place and conference for, I feel like it's a long time coming, I think. But I think one thing that really helped was a lot of the employees of color leadership team have been there for many years. We have members on the team that have been there for over 30 years that have been doing this work. And then also I actually spoke with Cynthia Tang, who is a former panelist and involved through this conference series as well. And she spoke about how she developed a really close relationship with administration, with parent communities. And so I just feel like building a collaboration and a community movement that is not just in the district, not just in your school, which I think is very important. But what I've been so impressed with what happened in Lexington, and I know it's because of the result of many years of work and long conversations, there's been trainings across the board. Like Cynthia did some work, I understand, with parent communities and educators. She gave presentations to all the principals at elementary schools. I know there was some conversation recently about or some questions in the past about elementary and middle school supports that have been offered. And so I did also want to just briefly address that we have there's been years in the making of a diversity, equity, and inclusion director position to kind of make a more cohesive movement and kind of bring more standardization across the board. I think some schools might be more advanced in their DEI work than others, and just sort of like understanding that everyone comes from different places and sort of just working together to just kind of build bridges and train staff and students in these conversations. So I know that in the past, there's been trainings done to administration, there's been trainings done to parent communities, there's been conversations that were fostered between the parent community and administration, so that when we're creating programs for the Asian community, that it wasn't just done for them, but with them, which I think is really important. I think there's some incredible Asian communities. One example was a rally, and that there's a Lexington sophomore that wrote a beautiful song that was made into a video that's been shared last week, and that put together and speaks to the communication and collaboration, not just in Lexington, but across the state among Asian communities. And I'm sure a lot of that was connected with the parent organizations. I think Cal was involved with that and other organizations. I heard there was more than 50 organizations that went into that rally in Boston Commons. So I just feel like there's such a beautiful movement, and that it just kind of comes from people who are really impassioned about the work and willing to take the time to listen and to work with many different people and have those conversations and spaces. And so it helps to have a DEI director. I think there was put in the chat, there is a website that our DEI district director created that sort of is, again, a place where we're trying to pull all these things together in one place as a public school system. So I think there's just a lot of things that are happening, but there's always more work to do. But it is kind of hopefully a place to give you guys some ideas of where you can start reaching across the aisle, whether it be with the parent community, administration, other schools, affinity groups, the employees of color leadership team goes from K to 12. But I also want to say that I find really remarkable that the employees of color leadership team or group is not just for administrators or educators, but it's also for cafeteria workers, for bus drivers. We're inviting everyone, class, whatever, A, C, D, all the different unions and levels are invited to our spaces and places. So that's hopefully giving you some ideas of different ways you can build community and collaboration across the aisle.
Yeah, absolutely. And what resonates with me so much in that, Maggie, is how this can't be reactive, which is what folks have been saying all night. It has to be deliberate. It has to be proactive, and it takes time. And so I think that's going to resonate with so many of us, hopefully. Our next question is for Jean. So we have a member attendee asking, if you have any thoughts on how to give space to elders in the Pan-Asian community to share their stories when trauma and perhaps cultural norms around not complaining may prevent elders from feeling comfortable talking about their individual stories.
Unmute. Yes, sorry. Yeah, I have a lot of ideas about that. And all different kinds. I think it's first of all, it is important to recognize that some may really not want to tell their stories, may not be ready to. But by and large, my experience over the 50 years of teaching and having students go and do oral histories with their grandparents, parents, elders, most end up not talking because they don't think anybody's interested in their story. So there's something very powerful about that one line, tell me your story, right? This is how history begins, tell me your story. So I think one of to link back to the history circles, now that I'm not teaching in the classroom, every single Asian American course, we came up with a lot of oral histories that oftentimes then got built upon and expanded and put into volumes, Children of War, for example, and the stories that they gathered from their elders. I think a lot of it is how to begin that process, because in a lot of families, I think just asking the question may not be able to do it. So if one could develop a more just every Friday, every once a month, let's all come together, look at some old photos, if there are any letters. Let's have questions about our family history, just talk, right? I know some of the things for Asian American API families is that language is a problem, right? The second and third generation oftentimes can't do that. So but there are ways around it. If there's some way to, and nowadays it's a lot easier with technology, you can do that. I think it's about saying, for a lot of elders, it's about realizing that their story is actually valued, and the next generation wants to hear it, and that if they go, that story goes with them, and that kind of cuts off, severs, right, a long family history. I think it's about helping elders understand that in a diaspora, it's different from back in our sending countries, where there's just an assumed maybe that each generation would know your story. In a diaspora, that's the whole point. There is a rupture, there's a loss. And part of it is helping them understand how important it is that we gather those stories. And so oral history projects, if you have sometimes teenagers, young adults in the home, they can talk to grandma and grandpa or elders in the community. If there are community centers, you can start that. If you develop a history circle, maybe part of the history circle is an oral history project. Everybody, identify some folks, and those folks can come in and talk. If they don't want to be interviewed, they can come in and give a talk about a piece of something we asked them, record it. And then make, art, and art is wonderful. Make art, make zines. It's about, it really is about communicating how important it is. And I think it's also important that I think people get scared off by trauma. They think that, I said this and I've made my grandfather or my mother, they start crying. Sometimes it's about sitting with that. It's about, we all know that sometimes it is actually that opening, that emotional opening that allows for the story to come. So don't be scared off by sadness or tears. Give it time, sit there, talk about look at some pictures, come back to that. And we all know that sometimes when someone starts crying, I've actually done this experiment. It doesn't last more than 15, 20 minutes. If we can sit with that, right? And be there for them and say, wow, this is really deep. And I really needed to hear this, let's cry together. And then let us go on and tell the story. So I'm really grateful for that question, because I think there is a whole chunk of our own critical histories that are not being actually taken down too well these days. So if anybody wants to, and the more the merrier, please do. And again, if people want, I have resources for how to conduct oral histories. Ways of, sometimes asking a question doesn't work, but looking at an old picture or an article or something does, okay?
Thank you. I know, sorry, Nora, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to again, sort of underline something, like a little nuance there. Jean, you just said many great things, but the piece about, again, this sort of invitation and permission, for those who maybe aren't of Asian descent, I think it's just really important, both in the Pan-Asian community. I think part of the movement that I'm seeing is that there's more capacity for that. Like, we're understanding as a community, but also we do need partners to help to create those, both the cultural norms as well as the institutional pieces to kind of invite that. And I think this is a great example of kind of that partnership that needs to happen. But also the sort of tenderness. I think Jean really touched on that, to not feel like we have to step away from the tenderness, but we do need to hold it and nurture it and be thoughtful about it, intentional about it. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I know exactly what I'm going to do with my youth group this coming month. So I appreciate it, Jean. This is great. This is great. So So let's jump to this next question. It's for Vino. It sounds like a lot of folks are asking kind of what are the challenges that you're noticing are faced by the international students that are often preventing them from integrating well into a new socio-linguistic environment in the States. What are you finding?
Well, the greatest strength of our international Chinese community is also one of the greatest challenges, because when you have a large number of people who can be perfectly happy within what is called a linguistic pod, there needs to be a greater push towards acquiring the structures and the language that they're going to need to succeed even more. So what I found in the program is that we encourage our students to go all out in making connections with students of every nationality. And we make them talk, we make them join societies. We find that it's initially comforting to stay within that linguistic pod, but that they when they venture out and gain more and more skills, they are amazed by what they can do. I mean, there was one of our students who received a neuroscience scholarship to do a PhD in Harvard, and she said, all the stuff that I'm doing now, I never dreamed that I'd be able to do it. But she did, and so did many, many others. And I think that it's overcoming that initial hurdle of thinking that they can't do it, because it's, as Anping was pointing out, it's a huge challenge. You are learning the language, but you're also competing in it, and you're performing in it. You're trying to win an internship in it. You're trying to make a career in it, and all of the social background that you have is not going to help you learn the new social background that you're trying to develop. And it's a new thing. It has to be acquired bit by bit. Am I being vague on this? Do you need more details?
I appreciate that. Do you have an example you want to provide maybe?
Yes, actually, one of my students was telling me, I was challenging him because I said, studies have shown that if you don't immediately start participating in class, even if it's to agree or if it's to say, yes, I think you have a great point, which is, as we know, a total giveaway class participation technique. Yes, great. And he said, well, you don't understand. I'm afraid that all these people know so much about this and I don't know anything about it. And right now they don't have any proof that I don't know anything about it. And if I open my mouth, they'll be totally sure I don't know anything about it. And I said to him, yes, so go through that and demonstrate that you know absolutely nothing about it. And the next time you say something, you'll know a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. It's not about being right all the time. It's not about being performative all the time. It's actually about participating.
Thank you.
And
so
he
much.
did. He went on to actually speak during commencement. It was awesome. This is someone that had a deadly terror of just major public speaking anxiety, and he went on to do that.
I love a good story like that. I appreciate it. Yeah, it's just great. It's great.
Can I jump in for?
Please.
I know only have a few minutes left, but I really want to take the Jean's message. Tell the story. Tell the story. We have to own the story. And people say, if you do not have narrative, people will create a narrative for you. You lose the control of your story. Let me tell one story as school committee member. Last summer, when we have school committee deliberating about the school opening, distant learning, and in-person learning, for the first time, the Zoom meeting have 2,000 people attend the school committee meeting. In the past, 20 people will be considered a lot of people in the room, but now 2,000, okay? When I was my turn to ask question, I did not start the question right away. I said something general. I comment on school department working hard, and our school committee chair was a little bit nervous, and she tried to push the agenda. And normally she's always using me as say, well, we don't have time, Anping, we can move on. And she said, Anping, if you're not ready, we move on. And I was offended. But in front of 2,000 people, you could not lose your emotion. And I said, I did have questions, so I asked question, but I was not happy. So after about an hour, when had time again for our school committee member to ask question, I said, I have comment to school committee for you. I said, I was not happy when you pushed me. There was a pattern, you used me always to push when your time was tight. And I said, there are cultural differences. Chinese, Asian people normally do not want to ask questions like, answer me this, answer me that, explain to me that. We always try to be, polite to school leaders. And I said, we are talking about cultural proficiency to students and to be more inclusive. And now this is a bad example at school committee when I was pushed around. I did not lose my voice, but I raised my voice a little bit. And that's exactly what I said. You speak up, you speak out, but you also speak together with other people. And I try to be as educator. I'm so happy I used that moment. I said, this will be learning moment for me, for you, I'm pointing to school committee chair, and for everybody. And after that, I got emails, people were impressed. But unfortunately, among my circle of friends, the Mandarin speaking friends, no one even knew what happened. No one was watching school committee.
I hear you.
That's a thing. But again, I want to say, it took the courage, it took the expertise, it took the experience, it took everything for me at that moment to say something. After I've been here for 30 years, working at department, finally I got a chance.
Thank you.
It was hard.
Yeah.
It was very hard. Most people probably will move on.
Yeah.
Oh, by the way, 3 days later, when I had another school committee meeting, school committee chair opened the meeting with a deep apology to me in front of, I don't know how, 100 people. And that was committee event. Everybody never think the school committee chair will make open apology to me at the beginning of school committee meeting. So just example.
Thank you, Anping. I appreciate that, and what a wonderful way to kind of close out. I'll invite, I wish we had so much more time with our panelists, but I'll invite Juliana to rejoin us. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Shub, for your thoughtful moderation, and everyone here for the incredible discussion and presentations. I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to speak very quickly. Just want to thank all of you, Jean, your keynote on looking at history through a critical lens, Vino's walkthrough of the power and goals that a language supportive program designed for Asian students can achieve, Maggie's presentation on how schools and programs can react and adapt to current events, and Anping's explanation of the importance of social and emotional learning. We are humbled and so appreciative. This brings us to the close, and I realize it is 9, but I hope you'll all stay with us for just 2 more minutes. This brings us to our close of the Let's Talk Professionals Conference. On behalf of our speakers and volunteers, I want to thank everyone for being with us these past 5 weeks. Your being here and your commitment to supporting your Asian and API students and patients means so much to us, and we know it will mean so much to them. Next slide. Some of you may know the Let's Talk Conference is a fully volunteer-driven effort. So this was first started in 2017. This has been an annual free in-person conference at the Harvard Graduate School of Education for Asian parents and students each spring. In the setting of COVID-19, like all of you, we had to pivot, and instead of launching an in-person professionals conference as originally planned, we moved to a virtual setting to bring this month's conference to all of you. This is our first ever Let's Talk Professionals Conference. So we would really like to invite you at the close of tonight's last webinar, please, if you can, take a minute to share your feedback with us. Based on your feedback, we really hope to continue to offer programming like this in the future, and so value your input. So please help us to create events to better support you and the work that you all do. Next slide. As always, you can find information about Let's Talk at our website and Facebook page, and you can reach us by email at any time. We really and truly would love to hear from you. All of us at Let's Talk want to thank you for joining us. And as you take such incredible care of your students and patients, we hope you will continue these important conversations and continue to take care of yourselves. And last but not least, I really have to give extra special thanks to our volunteers. As I mentioned earlier, I hope they'll stay with us. Let's Talk is a fully volunteer-driven effort, and it is a true labor of love for every person involved, our speakers, our volunteers, every person you saw here, and the many, many more behind the scenes. I had the great fortune to work closely with this incredible team, Annie, Malin, Jiaming, Connie, Finn, and Chao, to make the professional conference a reality. And it has truly been an honor and complete joy, and one of the silver linings of my year. In addition to our Let's Talk Professionals Conference planning team, there have been countless other volunteers who've been working throughout the year to bring the larger Let's Talk conference to our community. Josephine, Kim, and I cannot express enough the appreciation, admiration, and inspiration it is to know and work with each and every one of you. As we share some last messages from some members of our Let's Talk team, we invite all of you, our conference attendees, to please share a message in the chat for our volunteers, for our speakers, for each other, whatever moves you. We appreciate you. And from the bottom of our collective hearts, please keep the conversation going. And thank you again for joining us.